Ambedkar'S view on colonial Indian economy and protective commercial policy of British India's economy was far better than England's. England had failed to compete with Indian goods. In spite of the high cost of transportation of goods to England, Indian manufactured goods had captured the English market and England had lost her home markets. This led England to adopt a strong protectionist policy. England adopted direct and drastic measures, like increased tariff against Indian goods to destroy the competition from Indian goods and thus harm the Indian economy. In addition to high tariff, England used discriminatory trade practices and imposed heavy import duty on Indian manufactured goods. Few examples comparing import duty on goods from East Indies and West Indies are given below. Duty on sugar per quintal was £1 and 12 shillings for East Indies, and £1 and 4 shillings for West Indies. Duty on coffee was 9 pence for East Indies, and 6 pence for West Indies. Duty on spirits per gallon was £1 and 10 shillings for East Indies, and £1 for West Indies. Duty on spirits per gallon was 15 shillings for East Indies, and for West Indies, it was 8 shillings and 6 pence. Duty on tamarinds per pound was 6 shillings for East Indies, and 2 pence only for West Indies. Duty on tobacco per pound was 3 shillings for East Indies, and 2 shillings and 9 pence to West Indies. Duty on teak wood was £1 and 10 shillings for East Indies, but for West Indies it was 10 shillings only. Duty on wood not particularly enumerated, ad valorem, was 20% for East Indies and for 5% for West Indies. The English tariff on Indian goods was not only discriminatory but also differed according to its use in England. The ad valorem duty on piece goods or garments sold at East India House differed in the following way. The import duty on calicos was £3, 6 shillings and 8 pence %. If they were used for home consumption, there was a further duty of £68, 6 shillings and 8 pence %. The import duty on muslins was 10% and for home consumption was £27, 6 shillings and 8 pence %. Colored cloth was prohibited in England and import duty on this cloth was £3, 3 shillings and 8 pence %. These goods were only for exportation. Further, the Parliament of England had levied a new duty of 20% on the consolidated duty. This made the duty on calicos for home consumption £78, 6 shillings and 8 pence %, and the duty on muslin for home critique of colonial economy consumption £31, 6 shillings and 8 pence. Colonial customs duty policy and its impact on Indian traders. Ambedkar quotes Mr. Holt Mackenzie, who writes that some Indian commodities had to pass through as many as 10 custom houses and several subordinate chowkis before they reached the presidency. Few Indian goods could escape repeated detention. Even if there were no exactions and delays, the system would seriously hinder the commercial intercourse of the country. No interchange of goods could take place between districts separated by a line of custom houses unless the difference of price was large enough to cover the cost of transportation and the duty paid to the government. Therefore, the consumers faced the tax burden and needed to pay more for goods. In addition to the duty imposed by the government, custom house officers also demanded bribes. A rich merchant could afford to pay the amount demanded from him, but even a moderate demand would erase a petty trader's meager profits. The prime objective of British authorities and merchant body was finding a market for goods manufactured in the United Kingdom. Therefore, they gave more importance to import and export trade of India. As per the Regulation Act 9 of 1810, goods that the UK exported were exempted from customs duty and commodities that India exported, on which England made profit, such as indigo, cotton, wool and hemp, were exempted from customs duties. Ambedkar, quoting Lord Ellenborough on inland duties against Indians, writes that while the customs duty on cotton manufactures of England, imported into India, was 2-12%, cotton manufacturers of India were subjected to a duty of 7-12% on yarn, additional 2-12% on the manufactured article, and finally an additional 2-12% for white cloth dyed after Rana, making the total duty on cotton goods of India consumed in India, 17-12%. Similarly, the duty on raw leather was 5%, additional 5% on manufactured leather, and an additional 5% for leather made into boots and shoes. Thus, the total duty was 15% on Indian leather goods consumed in India. The customs duty paid on sugar was 5% when imported into a town, and an additional 5% for town duty. A duty was 5% was to be paid on sugar manufactured and exported from the same town. Thus the total duty paid on Indian sugar consumed in India was 15%. There were no less than 235 separate articles subjected to inland duties. In the name of power of search, the duty was levied on Indian commodities in each custom office, and officers exercised their power to stop the internal trade by delaying custom procedure to extort bribe from traders. The lack of uniform currency system was another obstacle to kill the Indian industries. Ambedkar quotes Frederick List, who said, "Had they sanctioned the free importation into England of Indian cotton and silk goods, the English cotton and silk manufacturers must, of necessity, soon come to a stand." India had not only the advantage of cheaper labor and raw material, but also the experience, the skill and the practice of centuries. Ambedkar cites historian H. Wilson, who admitted that England's trade practices were unjust towards India. Indian cotton and silk could be sold in England at a price 50 to 60% lower than that fabricated in England. However, England imposed duties of 70% and 80% on their value, thus prohibiting Indian exports to protect their cotton and silk industries. If England had not followed such prohibitory duties and decrees on Indian goods, the mills of Paisley and Manchester would have come to a complete standstill in spite of the power of steam behind them. Further, he said that if India had been independent, it could have retaliated, imposed prohibitive duties on British goods to protect its own productive industry from annihilation. However, India was not permitted to defend herself. India was under the mercy of a stranger. The British could impose their goods on Indians as they did not have to pay any duties. The foreign manufacturers employed their political arms to keep India down and strangle the competition. India could not contend with the British on equal terms. Therefore, manufacturers were compelled to take up farming for maintenance, a department already overstocked. The problem of farmers and colonial land policy, England's land revenue policy and prohibitory protectionist policy had ruined the Indian industry and farmers. Ambedkar quotes Bishop Heber, traveling in India in 1830, who writes about the pathetic economic condition of farmers who were pushed into misery and poverty. "Neither native nor European agriculturist, I think, can thrive at the present rate of taxation. Half the gross produce of the soil is demanded by government." Bishop Heber writes about how the Indian farmers cultivated very frugally and were prudent in consuming food. However, their provisions of grains became insufficient even during a favorable monsoon. When their crops failed in slight degree, even government assistance did not prevent men, women and children from dying. Bengal had fertile agrarian land and a system of permanent assessment because of which famine was unknown there. However, in northern India, the peasantry was worse off, poorer and more dispirited in the company's provinces than under native princes. In Madras Presidency, the soil was poor and farmers were worse off. He writes, "The fact is, no native prince demands the rent which we do, and making every allowance for the superior regularity of our system, etc., I met with very few men who will not, in confidence, own their belief that the people are overtaxed, and that the country is in a gradual state of impoverishment." Bishop Heber explains that the colonial collectors did not declare the gloomy status of people to the secretaries of Madras and Calcutta, lest it may defame them. Further, Bishop Heber speaks on trade and industries. He explains that the trade of Surat had fallen and consisted of raw cotton, which was shipped to Bombay. The English undersold the Indian manufactured goods, leading to a dismal decay of the circumstances of Indian merchants. Bishop Heber writes that the natives petitioned to the British Parliament, but the appeal was in vain. To ameliorate their misery, natives petitioned Parliament saying, that every critique of colonial economy encouragement is held out to the exportation from England to India of the growth and produce of foreign, as well as English industry, while many thousands of the natives of India, who, a short time ago, derived a livelihood from the growth of cotton and the manufacture of cotton goods, are without bread, in consequence of the facilities afforded to the produce of America, and the manufacturing industry of England. But the appeal was made in vain, and the interests of England always remained in the forefront in the eyes of those that were called upon to rule the destinies of India. Ambedkar critiques on financial and monetary economy in colonial India. Critique on financial economy in colonial India. Ambedkar examined the changes in administration and finance of the East India Company during the period 1792 to 1858, which led him to conclude that colonial rulers had imposed injustice on Indians. His detailed analysis of gross revenue and expenditure of colonial India revealed that the company had surplus revenue for 36 years and was in deficit for the remaining 30 years. Though the combined surplus was in excess of the combined deficit. The main reason for the deficit was that money was not saved in India. It went as a tribute and dividend to company shareholders. The money flow was not sufficient in India to pay to dividends, and it had an impact on increasing debt or public debt of India. The Indian debt was increased because the company borrowed money. There were two ways to raise loans. Within India by accepting exchange of loan notes. 2. Home bond debt raised in England by issuing bonds. Ambedkar had found that the Indian debt rose from £70 to £607, an increase of 767% in the years 1792 to 1857. However, the home bond debt never exceeded £66 during the years 1800 to 1857. The surprising fact was that Indian debt was more than home bond debt. The home bond debt did not increase because the English Parliament regulation limited the borrowing capacity of East India Company. The tax that the British government imposed on land was not only excessive, it was fluctuating and uncertain in many provinces. The tax rate for Indians ranged from 80 to 90%, while in England it was between 5 and 20% for 100 years up to 1798. The British government generated huge revenue during the period 1792 to 93 to 1885 to 86. The major components of average revenue are given below: land tax, 54% tax on salt, 11% opium duties, 8.7% customs duty, 6.2%. During the period 1800 to 1857, the British government spent between 45% and 64% of expenditure on military alone, whereas they spent negligible amount on public works in India. Ambedkar, quoting John Bright, wrote that a single city of Manchester in England had spent more on a single item, water, than the money spent on all kind of public works in India. The British administration and finance of East India Company benefited from financial settlement. The East India Company ceased to be a commercial corporation as per the Act of 1834. After this act, the company benefited in the following ways: 15% payment for territorial charges to England, 12% for liquidation of part of home debt, 13% for redemption of capital stock of the company. The public debt of India was entirely due to wars, and India had to bear the burden of debt. The company had spent £6,947,484 on wars, and this unproductive expenditure was placed on the shoulder of the poverty-stricken Indians. The revenue from India was spent outside India for non-Indian purpose. Ambedkar dissected the Act of 1858 and showed it to be unfavorable to India and having evil administrative objectives such as autocracy, secrecy, and a responsibility towards Indians. From an economic point of view, India contributed immensely to the prosperity of England, but did not get any economic benefits in return. England's contribution lay in the uneconomic realm, such as maintenance of peace, introduction of Western education, building modern institutions including administrative and judicial system. Ambedkar's contribution to the field of public finance and his earlier work on administration and finance of East India Company gave substantive inferences and criticism. He further developed his Ph.D. thesis on the evolution of provincial finance in British India. This work explores the central state financial relationship in British India during the period 1833 to 1921. He criticized the British government for its excessive revenue collection through taxation. However, a poor country like India had limits to taxation. As the result, the problem of equitable distribution of burden on various forms of government such as the central, provincial and local government assumed significance. The centralization of government finances was a failure on account of faulty fiscal system marked by injurious taxes and extravagant expenditure. The financial system collapsed due to imprudent and unsound fiscal policy. British India suffered its fiscal malady during 1792 to 1870 mainly because of the inadequacy of imperial system of finance. Financial inadequacy resulted in chronic budget deficit. Ambedkar in his study cautioned the British government that chronic budget deficit should be corrected not only by increasing the revenue, but also by increasing the stability and productivity of the nation. The taxing capacity of the country must give the benefit to the treasury and the people. He observed that land tax in India was very high, which prevented the prosperity of agriculture. Custom taxes hampered Indian manufacturers. Internal and external customs blocked trade and repressed industry. He urged that tax was not equitable. Landlords enjoyed conspicuous consumption and led a life of leisure while exploiting poor tenants. European civil servants reveled in the many exemptions and privileges and lived with pomp, while the Indian poor was harassed by taxes on salt and other items. The government was unable to alleviate the burden of taxes from the injurious revenue system. Ambedkar argued that when revenue laws are harmful to the people, the government can only blame itself for its empty treasury. The bulk of government revenue rose out of injurious taxes, and it spent them on unproductive uses. The government wasted between 52 and 80% of its revenue on war services. The salary of a European soldier was 4 times higher than that of an Indian. Though the war was fought in the name of peace, it did not bring any progress. Education formed no part of the expenditure incurred and useful public works were far and few between. There were no long-term plans in the imperial budget for the following sectors: railways, canals for navigation, irrigation, other aids to the development of commerce and industry. Education formed no part of the expenditure incurred and useful public works were far and few between. There were no long-term plans in the imperial budget for the following sectors: railways, canals for navigation, irrigation, other aids to the development of commerce and industry. A weak economy and chronic deficit prevailed in 1833 when the centralization of imperial finance and government was established. The imperial administration was not de jure but de facto. Administration of provinces was under the primary unix of executive, and the imperial administration was the coordinating authority. The dichotomy was dangerous for government finance. The expenditure budget was prepared by provincial governments, but the responsibility of finding resources rested on the Government of India, with the result that the Government of India came under financial strain. It was then realized that the provincial governments must draw up their own revenue and expenditure budget. In 1871, provincial budgets came into force. Ambedkar observed that in budget assignment, there were high taxes and inequitable taxation. The imperial government reduced income tax due to outcry of the richer classes, which led to additional deficit, hence it curtailed the assignments of the provinces. The provinces therefore had to resort to higher taxation and again impose tax and cesses on an already overburdened class of taxpayers, namely landholders. As a matter of justice, the income tax should have been under the state for their relief. This justice was absent for a long time from Financial Secretariat of Government of India. Ambedkar criticized in a healthy way the financial inadequacy of the new arrangement. The government had not been able to marshal in the two revenue sources properly, viz. land revenue and customs revenue. Critique on monetary economy in colonial India. At the time, 2 types of money systems were in use: silver standard and gold standard. Due to uncertainties in international exchange rate, it was difficult to define how much gold was equal to how much silver. The exchange rate between the rupee and the sterling was stable at 1 rupee equals 1 shilling and 10-1 pence prior to 1873, and its reflections in the exchange rate between gold and silver was 1 to 15-1. However, after 1873, the rupee-sterling parity was dislocated, which resulted in gold-silver exchange ratio losing its growth. Since India, a silver standard country, was bound to a gold standard country, in reality, the economic and financial life of India was controlled by relative values of gold and silver, which governed the rupee-sterling exchange. It was obvious that if India had to make gold payments to England, India had to bear the burden of the increasing value of gold. The payments included the following: interest on debt and stock of guaranteed railway companies, expenses on European troops maintained in India, pension and non-effective allowances payable in England, cost of home administration, supplies purchased in England for use or consumption in India. Because of the appreciation of gold value, a high tax and rigid financial economy was imposed to compensate for the increase in the cost of sterling. The English investor did not invest in Indian rupee securities due to fall in the gold value of silver and fall in the gold value of rupee securities. Even Indian trade and industry was affected by the fall in the value of rupee. Ultimately, foreign trade showed significant buoyancy, not Indian trade. The central government treasury was diminishing by the loss due to exchange. The fall of exchange and instability of silver both affected the fixed income groups, including a large section of Indian people, government, and Europeans. So to establish stable monetary conditions, restoration of common standard of value was needed. Ambedkar was in favor of a gold standard and criticized Keynes, who favored a gold exchange standard, because gold exchange standard does not have the stability of the gold standard. In the gold standard, additions to the supply of currency are so small that the stability of the standard does not get affected. On the other hand, in the gold exchange standard, the supply of currency is dependent of the will of the issuer, and hence its stability is more easily jeopardized. This was evident in India, where prices varied much less under the gold exchange standard. Ambedkar's criticism of colonial economy was based on his empirical and theoretical work on economic history, financial economy and monetary economics. He proved that the colonial rulers followed discriminatory trade policy, exploited Indian resources, overburdened Indian farmers with tax, failed to control the financial economy, created disequilibrium in monetary system, made the Indian government pay unjustifiably more to England. India was thus forced to remain an underdeveloped country, because its resources were exploited by England for its own economic development.